Good evening, and thank you very much. I would like to thank Amos and the organizers of this evening for the invitation to return here. It's an opportunity to remember that we cannot run these discussions about national security without Israel's national economy. After all, they are interwoven and intertwined. I would like to talk about a significantly economic topic that has security and social far-fetching ramifications. If the Palestinian negotiations do not succeed, and of course Israel will be blamed by the world for its failure. So much has been said about that, some of them because a kind of an emotional turbulence that was being sensed and felt. But I do not believe that anyone really did explore the facts and delve deeply into them. A survey that was prepared in the chief economist's office in the Ministry of Economy, I wanted him to examine what would happen if we have any kind of even partial boycott. If there's a failure in the negotiations, then every single Israeli citizen will be detrimentally affected in his pocket if there is a failure. There will be a tremendous detrimental effect to the state of Israel. So therefore, I think we should perhaps, people say that perhaps Europe is wrong because we will never compromise on our national security issues and whatever pressures they wield against us. And maybe it is wrong on a moral level because a world wherein people try to reconciliate themselves with murderers and people who oppress the rights of homosexuals and other civil rights and actually sanction the Hamas, but on the other hand, boycott us because we're the only democracy in the Middle East, I think is a world that has totally gone out of their mind. But people say we shouldn't fight it. I believe that we must fight it and not accept it. We should not accept that boycott, and I think that we have to fight against it. But believe me, the world is listening to us less and less. So even if we do start using that well-oiled sort of PR machine, unfortunately we're going to pay a very heavy price because people are not listening to us as much, and we should understand what that price is going to be, because when we grapple with security issues, the first thing that we need to do is that we have to have an updated intel system, and the fact that there's an economic crisis or possibility of crisis, then of course we need that kind of economic intel campaign as well. And since the report was actually compiled just recently, I wanted to bring some of it, and I'm going to actually delete part of it when I talk to you, or at least not talk about the classified part, because I do not want to provide ideas to our adversaries. But the main idea is that we are extremely vulnerable to pressures from the outside and sanctions. We are now at a point where we might come to a point that might detrimentally affect every citizen's pocket. Now, as any Israeli knows, the campaign against us started a long time ago, since the Durban conference in 2001, which was the active one of 171 BDS organizations in 2005. And there is an organized campaign that is wielding very strong pressure against all these governments around the world. This is a heinous campaign of people who are anti-Semitic, and believe me, they are trying to create that all the Palestinian problems emanate because of the settlements, and this is mendacious, because if the settlements were the only problem, how can they explain the Arab attempt to try and destroy us in 1948 or in 67 when there weren't any settlements? How can they explain the ongoing terror after the disengagement? How can they explain the fact that the Palestinians rejected at least twice proposals for far-fetching peace agreements that were offered by Israel? That our feeling of justice shouldn't make us ignore the situation in the field, on the ground. It has been ongoing in such a far-fetching manner. Anyone who is spearheading it are people in government or only semi-official ones. I'll give you a couple of examples now and expand on it. In July 2013, Catherine Ashton, the Foreign Minister of the European Unity, a memorandum to the various ministers in the 28 countries about boycotting specific products that come from the territories. At the moment this is being negotiated, but 14 of those countries are willing to continue marking those goods immediately. And according to our research unit in the Foreign Ministry, other than the Czech Republic, they are supporting the marking of those goods in case the negotiations fail. Since June 2013, the European Commission are not actually supporting any products that have marking from the point of view of the safety of the products that come from the territories. The Irish organization have also decided to boycott and even boycott investments that are connected to that. The Irish Teachers Organization believe also in boycotting an academic boycott. In Israel, in Great Britain, they have demanded of the actual government in British, and by the way, Israeli politicians in Israel are not that different from the British parliamentarians, and they have accepted things that have been said to them from that point of view as well. Now, if we're talking about other organizations, 4,000 professors in the States have also joined that academic boycott. Other faculties in Great Britain have signed a letter asking for diversion of investments and again an academic boycott against Israel. Tel Aviv, that was named, and there was supposed to be a ceremony in Brussels by the World Heritage Organization to be called a white town. That has also been cancelled. The film festival in Edinburgh returned a scholarship, a grant that was going to be given to the Edinburgh Festival. They said because, again, of our involvement in the security fence or whatever it was, the boycotting and then the territories, etc. The DIA, KIF, which is a pension fund that has over $500 billion, they actually decided that they would not invest anymore in Caterpillar because Caterpillar was selling bulldozers to Israel, who was using it to demolish houses in the territories, and other issues like that. The big Dutch water company Witten said that they would no longer be connected to Mekorot, our national water company, because of these issues as well. And for example, the President's Conference in Jerusalem, there were actual cancellations of participation because of it. There were others who said that they would no longer invest in Israeli banks because again of issues connected to the territories and issues connected to settlements. If we're talking about any agricultural export, would also be, I'm just talking about a few of them, Agresco and all sorts of other companies. That Marks and Spencer, for example, boycotts things from the West Bank since 2007. Export from the Jordan Valley has actually gone down by 14% because of sanctions on its policy. I can just go on and enumerate that entire list. And unfortunately, for a very long time, standing here on this stage. And it's not an esoteric process, and it doesn't only belong to certain extra-parliamentary, extra-governmental organizations, but it's from bottom up all the way to the higher echelons of power. And what in sociological terms you can call is activism without any effort. That is what is being done. And that is the greatest hobby of the 21st century. This international campaign against wearing furs, for example, is just a classic example of an invitation from the citizens to use activism without any effort. Because people don't really use don't actually wear furs. Anyway, most of them are artificial and then just as nice and warm and warming. So immediately you can just show how horrifically morally you feel astounded by these things, and suddenly you are saving so many innocent little animals from a terribly cruel death without any effort and without any investment. So what is this kind of activism without an effort? And that is a boycott on all the settlements and anyone who's connected to the settlement, which means the entire Israel economy. There's nothing easier for the average European than to announce that they are boycotting goods from the settlements and probably from all Israel in general. That's probably because they haven't come across very few. And after all, they have a reasonable level kind of moral declaration that not only makes him feel good with himself, but it's actually a rather well-cushioned campaign that they can run from their couches and their sofas at home. The motivation of this snowballing kind of campaign, I don't know what exactly it is, I don't know what a kind of self-righteousness that's going on here or something, does not decrease the actual clout of that process. And it has an economic effect that is significant and real. When you think that in Israel, when you talk about a European boycott, then the camembert won't arrive on time. That's not the situation. Europe is our main trade center. 33% is actually with Europe. So in other words, if we look about the very reasonable scenario, they're worse, believe me, if only 20% of that export to the European Union will be curbed, and the direct investments from there will also be curbed, the manufacture, the production in Israel will be affected by 20 million shekels a year, and over 900 employees will be immediately fired. So just that kind of association agreement that we have with the European Union will have a detrimental effect of 3.5 million shekels per annum. Only if we're just talking about those that are made redundant during that year. These are just small examples of it all. But even these examples express the scope that will detrimentally affect every single pocket of every single citizen. Even if you are in favor of the negotiations or against it, you have to understand the scope of what is going on, the gamut of it all, because the quality of life, of course, will spiral. The standard of living will spiral. The quality of life will be decreased immediately. We're talking about public transport, media, communications, anything else. And of course, all the budget that is connected to health, education, everything, and of course security as well. At the moment, 6.5% of our budget of our GDP, of course, is in the security and defense issues. So either they will be very drastically cut back, or they will have to be increased drastically. These GDP issues, it's going to have a terrible detrimental effect. So therefore you have to tailor-make it all and tie all these ends together. It's very difficult to think of a situation wherein Europe will not be a gatekeeper of the world. But believe me, the other markets around the world, if they know that there's a boycott in Europe, do you think that they won't join forces with this boycott? And this actually emanates from the fact that we're not really concerned with that because we don't really feel it yet, and therefore it's very easy to ignore this threat that is hovering above us. The graduality, the gradation of the way it is working, that it is so gradually, it's only sort of creeping towards us, makes citizens, in contrast to the real situation, to the reality of it, is that things are under control, erroneously so. For example, let's think, the South African model, the fact that the citizens and the governments understood very belatedly what really was happening. The process was happening around them and in their direction, creeping slowly. They could have said in hindsight that they turned into an isolated outcast country, that only suddenly one day they suddenly discovered that they're not being invited to the cricket championships, world championships. And we are now on that way, and now suddenly Maccabi basketball cannot play in the Euro League, and our president won't be invited to Davos, and iPhone 6 won't arrive on Israel's doorstep. So this is the tipping point. That is an expression that was coined by Fillmore and Siki in 1968 that dealt in the process wherein a specific norm turns into something mandatory around the world. And the classic example is when all of us were growing up, smoking, for example. Everyone knew that it had a detrimental effect on your health when we were growing up. It was also something sexy and very socially acceptable, and Humphrey Bogart and James Dean smoked, and that added to their image. It augmented it. But then a process started where the PR actually was enhanced, and suddenly social leaders started against it, and they suddenly used all this being disseminated, and they're not sure exactly when it happened, but suddenly the tipping point arrived, and from that moment onwards, it was obvious to all citizens around the world that people should not smoke, that it is carcinogenic, and that it is detrimental to your health, etc., etc. The facts in the field perhaps change, but it always starts with NGOs that we call norm entrepreneurs, and it is disseminated by sort of renowned personalities, and this motivates a second level of the actual process, which is called the stream of norm, which then accelerates and gathers momentum until the norm becomes into a global rule. Now, where do we stand in this description? Actually at that tipping point. In other words, that transitory point from one phase to the other. The direction is clear, but we still have a possibility to stop it, to curb it. If we do not, there's going to be a whole series of things that are going to happen that do not seem connected, but suddenly they are going to amalgamate to create one direct, coherent direction and leave Israel outside the economic pitch and the economic game. And of course I know that it's preferable not to talk about things because it makes the people that have initiated that boycott suddenly realize that it is actually working and it will affect us, but that is old-fashioned, because anyone who does not recognize the fact that this is a brave, new, exposed and transparent world when everything is known and all the economic rules are on the same kind of network, and all those the companies that do the grading and the ranking know exactly what our weaknesses are, whether we talk about them or not, and to pretend that reality is not really taking place is not a good idea. Ignoring it and putting blinkers over our eyes. It's not a good idea. When I was actually handed that report by the chief economist when we were burning the midnight oil trying to interpret it, it was published that the German government is going to precondition various issues according to this issues with the high-tech companies. In other words, those that are in East Jerusalem and in over the Green Line will, and that's what Germany said, if those high-tech companies will not receive any grafts. At least up to now, we believe that Germany was a country that we enjoyed some kind of immunity from this boycott because of the known reasons. But this is very concerning. It didn't appear in the report. And that really should concern us, because there were deliberations between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Germany for over a year, and we believed that this was under control until we suddenly found out that it was not under control. With all due respect to our ability to foresee things and predict things, we are going to be stunned by these boycotts, threats and these boycotts by totally unexpected places. And we're going to suddenly find ourselves sitting there and saying, hey, how come we didn't see the writing on the wall? And just because the stains of its past, what Germany should be more vulnerable than any that talks about the campaign that defends and protects the underdogs. I want to actually not talk about the alternative here, that what happens if there is an agreement, but I'd just like to talk about what Minister Bennett said, that the Palestinian state will collapse our economy, did not stand any test that we have actually explored. In fact, according to our data, reaching an agreement will save us at least 20 million shekels per annum and an increase of at least 60 million per annum. In other words, direct and indirect reverberations and echoes on us, and if we're talking about tax levying, etc. But I won't go into all that, because I think that we are not satisfied only because of the prophecies of the apocalypse, of the right-wingers, etc., etc., and because we're going to talk about beating our plowshares, etc., etc. But we will always be surprised that the Israeli public is so intelligent, and it will not accept what all this panic-mongering. For those who believe that Allah is God and are very extremist, they will always exist. But with a civilized, open-eyed kind of economy, instead of subjecting people to what was decided in advance. And for example, the left who think that at any price, against all odds, we have to create peace, they're also wrong. And the right-wingers are also wrong. Our aim as a centrist party is that there should be an efficient separation from the Palestinians while protecting the national and economic interests of the State of Israel. Any kind of other solution would bring us to a binational solution, and that will be the end of a Jewish state and the end of Zionist endeavor. Up to now, Israel was exposed to the security threats of a conventional, all-comprehensive war. That threat no longer exists. Israel is economically exposed much more than it is even exposed security-wise now. We sometimes forget that our defense capabilities is a tool. It's not an aim. It's a tool that should enable us to reach an agreement that would strengthen the economy and the future of Israel as a Jewish state. The statement of my dear friend Bugi Ayalon that the alternative to the European boycott should be a strategic threat with bombs falling on our airports, etc., etc. No, unless we reach a political agreement, we will have not only a European boycott, economic crisis, but into total isolation with a terrible brain drain and the redundancy of the laying off of so many of our employees, and missiles from Nablus onto the Ben Gurion Airport and from so many other places. The decisions we take in the next few months do not only touch our fates in our lives, they will mold the lives and the fate of our children. That does not make us agree, that should not make us agree to everything, but at least it makes us incumbent to run a true, sincere, perhaps painful dialogue with each other, and we shouldn't just sort of peep out at the coming primaries or elections, but we should really delve deeply into it and not hide the truth from ourselves and really understand and recognize the truth of it all.